The Real Lord of the Flies. What happened when 6 boys were shipwrecked for 15 months? By Mr. Bergman. When a group of schoolboys were marooned on an island in 1965, it turned out very differently from William Golding's bestseller. For centuries, Western culture had been permeated with the idea that humans are selfish creatures, that the cynical image of humanity had brought proclaimed in films and in novels of history books and scientific research. But in the last 20 years, something extraordinary has happened. Scientists from all over the world have switched to a more hopeful view of mankind. This development is still so young that researchers in different fields often don't even know about each other. When I started writing this book about hopeful view, I knew that there was one story I would have to address. It takes place on a deserted island somewhere in the Pacific. A plane had just gone down. The only survivors are some British schoolboys who can't believe their good fortune. Nothing but beach, shells, and water for miles, and even better, no grown-ups. On the very first day, the boys institute a democracy of sorts. One boy, Ralph, is elected to the group's leader. Athletic, charismatic, and handsome. To play the game is simple. Have fun and survive. Make smoke signals for passing ships. Number 1 is success. The others? Not much. The boys are more interested in feasting and frolicking than in tending the fire. Not before long, they have begun painting their faces and casting off their clothes, and developed an overpowering urge to punch, kick, and bite. By the time the British naval officer comes ashore on the island, it is smoldering wasteland. 3 of the children are dead. I should have thought, says the officer, that a pack of British boys would have been able to put up a better show than that. At this, Ralph bursts into tears. Ralph wept at the end of his innocence, we read, and the darkness of man's heart. The story never happened. An English schoolmaster, William Golding, made up the story in 1951, and his novel Lord of the Flies would sell tens of millions of copies, to be translated into more than 30 languages, and hailed as one of the classics of the 20th century. In hindsight, the secret to the book's success is clear. Golding had a masterful ability to portray the darkest depths of mankind. And of course, he had the Zeitgeist, the defining spirit of mood, in the 1960s on his side. And when the generation was questioning their parents about aristocracies, atrocities of the Second World War, had Auschwitz been an anomaly? They wanted to know, or was Nazi hiding in each of us? I first read Lord of the Flies as a teenager, and I remember feeling disillusioned afterwards. But not for the second did I think to doubt Golding's view of human nature. That didn't happen until years later, when I began delving into the author's life. I learned what an unhappy individual he had been, an alcoholic prone to depression. I've always understood the Nazis, Golding confessed, because I am that sort of by nature, and partly because I had a sad self-knowledge, he wrote of Lord of the Flies. I began to wonder, had anyone studied his real childhood would have found themselves alone on a deserted island? I wrote an article on the subject in which I compared Lord of the Flies to a modern scientific insights that concluded that in all probability kids would act very differently. Readers responded skeptically, and all of my examples concerning kids at home, at school, at summer camps thus began my quest for the real Lord of the Flies. After trawling the web, I came across an obscure blog that told of an arresting story. One day in 1977, 6 boys set out from Tonga on a fishing trip. Caught in a huge storm, the boys were shipwrecked on a deserted island. And what did they do, this little tribe? They made a pact never to quarrel. The article did not provide any source, but sometimes it takes as a stroke of luck. By sifting through newspaper archives one day, I typed across incorrectly And there I was. The reference 1977 turned out to have a typo. In October of 1966 edition of Australian newspaper The Age, a headline jumped out at me. Sunday showing Tonganogan castaways. The story concerned 6 boys who had been found 3 weeks earlier on a rocky inland of Tonga, the island group in the Pacific Ocean. The boys had been rescued by an Australian sea captain after being marooned on the island of Atay for more than a year. According to the article, the captain had even gotten a television station to film a reenactment of the boys' adventure. I was burning with question. Where were the boys? Were they still alive? I could find the television footage. More importantly, though, I had a lead, the captain's name, Peter Warner. I searched out for him, and I had another stroke of luck. In a recent tiny picture in a local newspaper from Mackay, Australia, I came across the headline, "Mate share 50-year bond," printed alongside the photograph of 2 men smiling with one arm slung around the other. The article began, "Deep in a banana plantation in Tula, nearly in Lismore, sat an unlikely pair of mates. The elder, 83 years old, the son of a wealthy industrialist, and the younger, 67, was literally a child of nature. Their names, Peter Warner and Manapatu Tutau. And where had they met? On a deserted island. My wife Muriette and I rented a car in Brisbane, and some 3 hours later we were at our destination, a spot in the middle of nowhere, stumped by Google Maps. Yet here I was, sitting in front of a low-slung house of dirt off the road, and a man who had rescued 6 lost boys 50 years ago, Captain Peter Warner. Peter was the youngest son of Arthur Warner, once about the richest industrial and most powerful men in Australia. Back in the 1930s, Arthur ruled over the vast empire called Electronic Industries, which dominated the country's radio market at the time. Peter was groomed to follow his father's footsteps. Instead, at the age of 17, he ran away to the sea in search of adventure and spent the next few years sailing from Hong Kong to Stockholm to Shanghai to St. Petersburg. And when he finally returned 5 years later, the prodigal son proudly presented his father with a Swedish captain's certificate. Unimpressed, Warner Sr. demanded that his son learn a useful profession. "What's easiest?" Peter asked. Accountancy, Arthur lied. Peter went to work for his father's company, and yet the sea still beckoned, and whenever he could, he went out to Tasmania, where he kept his own fishing fleet. It was this that brought him to Tonga in the winter of 1966. On the way home, he took a little detour, and when he saw it, a minuscule island in the azure sea, Alta. The island had been inhabited once until a dark day in 1863, when a slave ship appeared on the horizon and sailed off with all the natives, and since then Alta had been deserted, cursed and forgotten. But Peter noticed something odd. Peering through the binoculars, he saw burning patches on the green cliffs. And in the tropics, it's unusual for fires to start spontaneously, he told us half a century later. Then he saw a boy, naked, hair down to his shoulders. This wild creature leaped from cliff to cliff, plunging into the water. Suddenly, more boys followed, screaming at the top of their lungs. It didn't take long for the first boy to reach my boat. "My name is Stephen," he cried in perfect English. "There are 6 of us, and we reckon we've been here about 15 months. The boys, once aboard, claimed that they were students of a boarding school in Nuku'alofa, the Tonglan capital. Sick of school meals, they had decided to take a fishing boat out one day to get caught in a storm. Likely story, Peter thought. Using his 2-way radio, he called for Nuku'alofa, and "We've got 6 kids here," said the operator. "Stand by." And then came a response. 20 minutes ticked by. As Peter tells the story, he gets a little misty-eyed. Finally, very tearfully, the operator came to the radio and said, "You found them. These boys have been given up for dead. Funerals have been held. It's them. This is a miracle." In the months that followed, I tried to reconstruct precisely as possible what had happened on Alta. Peter's memory turned out to be excellent. Even at the age of 90, everything being recounted was consistent with my foremost of the source, Manitou, 15 years old at the time, now pushing 70, who lived just a few hours' drive from him. In the real Lord of the Flies, Mano told us that beginning in June 1965, the protagonists were 6 boys: Simone, Stephen, Colo, David, Luke, and Mano, all pupils at the Catholic boarding school in Eufaula. The oldest was 16, the youngest was 13, and they had one thing in common: they were bored witless. So they came up with a plan to escape to Fiji, some 500 miles away, or even all the way to New Zealand. There was only one obstacle: none of them owned a boat, so they decided to borrow one from Mr. Talauna, a fisherman, and they all disliked. The boys took little time to prepare for their voyage. 2 sacks of bananas, a few coconuts, and a small gas burner were all the supplies that they had packed. It didn't occur to any of them to bring a map or even a compass. No one noticed the small craft leaving the harbor that evening. Skies were fair, only mild breezes ruffled the calm seas. But that night the boys made a grave error. They fell asleep. A few hours later they awoke and the water was crashing all around their heads. It was dark. They hoisted a sail which the wind promptly tore to shreds, and the next was to break the rudder. We drifted for 8 days, Mano told me, without food, without water. The boys tried catching fish, and they managed to collect some rainwater in a hollowed-out coconut shell, and they shared it equally between them, each taking a sip in the morning and another in the evening. But on the 8th day they spied a miracle on the horizon. It was a smallish island, to be precise, not even a tropical paradise with waving palm trees and sandy beaches, but a hulking mass of rocks jutting up more than 1,000 feet in the ocean. These days Alta is considered uninhabitable. By the time we arrived, Captain Warner wrote in his memoirs, the boys had set up a small commune with a food garden hollowed out of tree trunks to store rainwater, a gymnasium with curious weights, a badminton court, chicken pens, and permanent fire, all from handiwork of an old knife blade and determination. While the boys in Lord of the Flies had come to blows over fire, those in real-life version tended their flames so it never went out for more than a year. The kids agreed to work in teams of 2, drawing up a strict roster for the garden, kitchen, and guard duty. Sometimes they quarreled, but whatever happened, they solved it by imposing a timeout. Their days began and ended with song and prayer. Colo fashioned a makeshift guitar from a piece of driftwood, half a coconut shell, and 6 steel wires that were salvaged from their wrecked boat. The instrument Peter kept all these days and played it to lift his spirits. And their spirits needed lifting. All summer long it hardly rained, driving the boys frantic with thirst, and they tried constructing a raft in order to leave the island, but it fell apart in the crashing surf. Worst of all, Stephen had slipped one day, fell off a cliff, and broke his leg. The other boys, picking their way down after him, had helped him back up to the top. They set his leg using sticks and leaves. "Don't worry," Simon joked. "We'll all do your work. You lie there like the king of Tupau himself." They survived initially on fish, coconuts, and tame birds. They drank blood as well as eating their meat. Seabird eggs were sucked dry. Later they got on top of the island and they found an ancient volcanic crater where people had lived for a century before. There the boys discovered wild taro, bananas, chickens, which had reproduced for 100 years since the Tonganoggans had left. They were finally rescued on Sunday, September 11, 1966. The local physician had expressed astonishment in their well-muscled physiques and Stephen's perfectly healed leg. But it wasn't until the end, when the little boys' adventure, because they had arrived back in Newfoundland police, boarded a boat and arrested the boys and threw them in jail. Mr. Ula, who had sailing boat they had borrowed 15 months early, was still furious and decided to press charges. Fortunately for the boys, Peter came up with a plan. It occurred to him that their story of the shipwreck was perfect for Hollywood material, and he began his father's corporate corporate accountant. Peter managed the company's film rights. He knew the people in TV, so that the Tongan, he called up the manager of Channel 7 in Sydney. You can have the Australian rights, he said, and he told them, give me your word on the rights. Next, Peter paid Mr. Ufanga the $150 for his oldest boat, and they got the boys released on the condition that they would cooperate with the movie. A few days later, Channel 7 arrived. The move when the boys returned to their families in Tonga was jubilant. Although the entire island of Haffa, populated 900, had turned out to welcome them home, Peter was proclaimed a national hero. Soon he received a message from King Tufana IV himself, inviting the captain for an audience. Thank you for rescuing 6 of my subjects, His Royal Highness said. Now, is there anything I can do for you? The captain didn't have to think long. Yes, I would like to trap lobsters in these waters and start my own business here. The king consented, and Peter returned to Sydney, resigned from his father's company, and commissioned a new ship. And then he had 6 boys brought over from that granted him one thing, that he had started an opportunity to see the world beyond Tonga. He hired them as crews of his new fishing boat. While the boys of Alta have been consigned to obscurity, Golding's book is still widely read. Media historians even credit him as being unwittingly originator of one of the most popular entertainment genres on television, reality TV. I read and reread Lord of the Flies, divulging the creative or hit series Survivor in an interview. It is time we told a different story. The real Lord of the Flies is a tale of friendship and loyalty, one that illustrates how much stronger we are if we learn to live with each other. After my wife took Peter's picture, he turned to a cabinet and rummaged and found a bit, and then he drew out a heavy sack of papers and he laid it in my hands. His memoirs, he explained, written for his children and grandchildren. I looked down at the first page. Life has taught me a great deal, it began, including the lesson that you should always look for what is good and positive in people. This is adapted from an excerpt of Rutger Bregman's Humankind, translated by Elizabeth Matten and Erica Moore.